Thanks, Kelly. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Liz. Good morning, Nilangi. Good morning to everyone. Hi. Good to see everyone. Let's take another minute or so for other folks to join and see if we end up with like a group of 10 before we head into Melissa's presentation. Today we don't have a mini journal club, so Melissa, you have the full hour.
Okay.
For time. But before we get started, does anyone want to share hellos, kudos, new resources, things that you're working on, things of interest?
Congrats to Angelique for submitting all this.
Got submitted a grant. That was very exciting. Brian knows it was we hope we get the chance to resubmit is the exciting the way I see it. Yep. Did anyone else have stuff that went in for the May deadline? No. Brian, were you on anything this round?
For new grant submissions?
Or resubmissions, anything?
No, I'm busy with transfer applications. As many of you know, Kara Lewis has left Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute to be the Deputy Director for the Center for Translation Research and Implementation Science, or CITRIS, at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which is exciting to have her sort of climb into an even higher leadership position and be able to influence the direction that the field goes. But it did mean that she had to leave all of her grant funded work behind. So my time in the last 3 or 4 months has been figuring out how to get the R01s and the P50s and all that kind of stuff that we've been working on together transferred from KP to UW. Not so easy to do anyway. So no, I have not had a moment to think about new work. I've mostly just been trying to figure out how we can keep the work that we already have going.
That's a ton, Brian. I know I've seen one friend who has moved institutions and tried to move only 2 grants, and it took months. It is so complex. I didn't have any awareness of that before. Wow. I feel for you tons. I see Kelly nodding her head, recognizing what that lift is like.
Yeah, we moved one, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and it took a year.
Don't tell me that. We're active without award for 90 days, which is as much as UW will allow you to work on something without a notice of award. And yeah, I am concerned that we are going to have to cease work on this project after 90 days.
The 90 days is the if it's NIH funding, I'm assuming. Yeah, they allow for 90 days of pre-award work. So that's kind of what that is.
Yep. So the clock is ticking, and we'll see if it runs out before we get approvals. I've not heard it happen that quickly, so I have the feeling we're going to end up with a work stoppage here.
I'm sorry, Brian, that sounds hard. I'm really excited for Kara, and I'm also really excited for NHLBI to have her, and for all of us to have exciting new RFAs that borrow from her expertise and vision for what the field looks like. So we'll look forward to that. Yeah. Well, it looks like we are at seven strong, and many who are interested in a recording. 8 strong. Well, why don't we jump on in to our main presentation for the day. So Melissa Mugambi is going to be presenting to us about a discrete choice experiment. And she's been thinking about how to structure this, how to create the different indicators within it, and how to set this up. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about this. This is based on her K Career Development Award. And take it away, Melissa. We're really thrilled to have you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Just checking. It's a full slide, not strange things.
It's in the right format. Yep.
Okay. All right. Let me 1 second. This thing kind of gets in my way. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm just gonna cover. I think we have an hour, maybe 45 minutes worth of talk time. I don't know, but feel free to jump in. I guess it should be fine. I'm really just going to talk to you about formative work that we've been doing in developing a discrete choice experiment. So really to design pharmacy-based HIV prevention services for pregnant women in Western Kenya. And this talk, it's largely going to focus on the attribute and level development. So I'll just get that into it. So, and just in terms of context, currently women in Western Kenya, they receive HIV prevention services in antenatal care clinics, that's pregnant women. We want to develop a pharmacy alternative and want to know what women think a pharmacy alternative might look like, just as a quick overview. And so here, so when I actually, Anjali is familiar with this, but when I first joined, I started working in a team that Anjali's heavily been involved with, implementing PrEP for pregnant women in public health facilities in Western Kenya. And over a decade ago, so this team, so led by Doctors John Kanuthia and Grace John Stewart, they noted a high incidence of HIV during pregnancy and postpartum. And so it's estimated that roughly 1/3 of infant HIV infections are due to acute maternal HIV in pregnancy. And so as part of an effort to develop a research portfolio, my initial thinking was centered on the idea that delayed and irregular utilization of antenatal care clinics, really limit opportunities to realize the full benefits of HIV prevention services among pregnant women. So you can see from the stats here, roughly 65 to 80%, this is from multiple studies, of pregnant women don't present for antenatal care in the first trimester, and then just over half of pregnant women attend 4 more antenatal care visits. And then also from, I think, a couple of studies, 70 to 90% of pregnant women don't receive a repeat HIV test before delivery. So definitely several gaps in the pregnancy care continuum that can influence HIV prevention services. So what we do know is that pregnant women might delay antenatal care due to multiple barriers. So, and here these barriers are captured using the capability, opportunity, and motivation model for behavior, so COM-B. So for example, women might be uncertain of their pregnancy status. They might lack knowledge about the importance of antenatal care, or maybe the other issues around transportation, high transportation costs. And so our initial thinking, so we're intrigued by the idea that maybe perhaps community pharmacies might be strategically positioned to address these barriers to early antenatal care. This is because community pharmacies are often the first point of contact for basic health services. People typically find them more accessible, they save time. You can also get information about certain health products, etc. And so we thought maybe we could engage community pharmacies, as an example, to promote and distribute pregnancy tests and address uncertainty of pregnancy status among women. So that's a role that community pharmacies could play in addressing the barriers that I talked about earlier. And the reason here is other studies have found that women who use pregnancy tests are more likely to present earlier for antenatal care. However, we really first needed to understand these barriers contextually and explore whether it's feasible for pharmacies to play a role in addressing these barriers. So that's kind of where we started off. And then we began conducting a suite of studies to evaluate how to engage pharmacies in improving access to antenatal care and HIV prevention services. And most of the early formative work has focused on understanding whether this idea really makes sense. So looking at issues are like what the barriers to our early antenatal care are in this population. Do pregnant women even visit pharmacies in early pregnancy, so on and so forth. And also, given that there were ongoing efforts to explore the feasibility of implementing PrEP in pharmacies in Kenya, we expanded our work to include a discrete choice experiment survey to identify optimal HIV prevention interventions that could be delivered by pharmacies for pregnant women. And so that's really the focus of our discussion today. Okay, and so what I want to do here is just really take a step back and walk you through what discrete choice experiments are. So that you know, some of you may be familiar. I know Liz has been doing a lot of work in this area as well. Discrete choice experiments are really designed to simulate choice behavior. And so first we create hypothetical service scenarios where people are asked to make a choice among alternative services. And then we tell people the characteristics or attributes that make up the service, and then ask them to choose a service. So, and this borrowed from the Health Economics Research Unit at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Discrete choice experiments are based on the idea that people value the characteristics or attributes that make up a service. So just an example, if I had to choose or had to decide between two different primary care services, service A and service B, and for service A, you should see that on the screen there, the soonest I can schedule an appointment is in 10 days, and I will see a female provider, and the clinic is further away, maybe about a 20-minute drive. Or alternatively, with service B, I can schedule an appointment in 2 days. I can see a male provider and the clinic is closer, less than a 5-minute drive. Personally, like I would choose service A, and this is actually a choice I had to make last year, and I ended up opting for seeing a female provider further away because that was more important to me. Sadly, this time around, when I'm trying to schedule my annual checkup, and I cannot find her, so I think I'll just have to opt for service B this year. But ultimately, when we're given a choice, we select a service based on the characteristics that are more important to us. And then this is just to show that when people choose services, they make trade-offs among the attributes. So we can quantify the relative importance of the attributes. So basically, in a discrete choice experiment survey, what you want to do, you present people with a series of questions, as you can see here, and we ask them to choose among alternative services, and a certain benefit or utility is gained from choosing that service. And then we can really quantify which are the most important attributes to them. And why do we do this? Ultimately, we get at understanding what users value. And understanding what users value is an important aspect of service design because we want to create values for users. We want to improve the uptake of services, and ultimately, with this, improve the impact of services. So right now, what we're trying to do is we're following key steps to implement a discrete choice experiment to design pharmacy-based HIV prevention services for pregnant women. And last year, we conducted qualitative interviews with women, health providers, and technical experts to develop attributes and levels. So the attributes, just going back here again for your reference, these are attributes. So on your left, you see the characteristic or attributes, so time to appointment, and then the levels. So say under time to appointment, the level would be 10 days or 2 days. So we spent some time trying to develop these attributes and levels for designing the pharmacy services. And so I'll focus on that development process today. So I guess it's interesting with discrete choice experiments, even just getting exposed to the methodology. I think there are really different ways out there in terms of getting to the attributes and levels, and there's been a lot of emphasis in kind of having a more systematic approach using qualitative work. So for the purpose of this discussion, we can consider 2 ways to look at the process of developing attributes and levels. So firstly, we can design a program based solely on women's preferences. So which means the focus is on understanding what women value and what they would like to see in a program, and then tailoring the program to meet their unique needs and preferences. So you could consider this more of a bottom-up approach, so in which the attributes are derived from concepts. So it's really doing all these like qualitative interviews and really developing the themes and translating that to concepts and then attributes. Or secondly, we can use existing attributes. So maybe somebody has already done a study and they pretty much have defined all these different attributes. And our goal is to determine how the defined attributes impact women's preferences. So we just use that in coming up with another survey. In reality, so for this study, we were somewhere in the middle. So we started off with some pre-existing attributes, that is, something that was known about pharmacy-based services versus something that's conceptual. And our goal was to understand which attributes were meaningful or important to women and could be realistically implemented given the constraints. So we're designing a pharmacy-based program, and we ultimately, hopefully, we want to make policy recommendations for what such a program should look like. So essentially, we took these list of attributes to the women and kind of just got their thoughts, and asked them what they valued, what was important to them, and whether there was anything else we had missed. So just to walk you through that process, we initially identified 11 attributes, so informed by the research question, the literature and pilot study findings. There were 5 HIV prevention attributes. When a woman attends antenatal care for the first time, she's initially tested for HIV. And then screening pregnant women for HIV during their first antenatal care encounter is the natural, so that's the first step in the HIV prevention cascade. So once women are identified and at risk, and maybe ideally self-identified at risk and requesting HIV prevention tools, we can use multiple HIV prevention tools. So these include partner testing, screening and management of sexually transmitted infections, and then as well as PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. And then there were 6 service delivery attributes that we also looked at. So location, the health, like whether a health provider would be present, whether there was a private room available, service fee, how much it would cost, wait time, and then follow up, how women should be followed up after receiving a service. And we evaluated the importance of these attributes through stakeholder interviews that were held last year, as I mentioned earlier, so March through November 2022. The rationale for the stakeholder interviews with women was to understand how women think about alternatives for getting HIV prevention services in a pharmacy setting compared to what's currently available, and to determine what attributes they care or don't care about and why. And then finally, with the health providers and technical experts, we validated the findings from the interviews and then evaluated the feasibility of the attributes. And it was largely an iterative process. This slide is just to show that we evaluated, refined, and updated the attributes and levels. So basically, after each stakeholder interview, we debriefed key findings with the team, evaluated potential changes to the attributes, and then updated the attributes based on these findings. So yeah, and then this, still updating this here, but the slide just shows that we interviewed a diverse group of stakeholders, interviewed 52 women, 39 health providers, and 8 technical experts. Data for the technical experts is not shown here. And to get a better sense of who the women were, the median age was 24 years, roughly half were married or living with a partner and unemployed. And the majority had previously been pregnant and visited a pharmacy at least every 2 or 3 months in the past year. Okay. So I'll jump into this. So we refined and reduced the attributes to include 4 HIV prevention intervention attributes, and I'll walk you through how those decisions were made. So one of the things, so we had the HIV test type as an attribute, and we expanded that from 2 to 3 levels. So initially we had just oral swab test and blood-based fingerprint prick test, the assumption that women would do these tests on their own, but we expanded this to include also provider-assisted testing to make sure that option was available. And what we learned was women expressed preferences for both the oral swab test and blood-based finger prick test, as you can see captured in this quote. So a 32-year-old married female said, "I prefer the oral swab because personally I do fear the needle prick." And while a 25-year-old single female said, "The one for the blood because it is easier. If it's being done there, then one is able to get the accurate test result." So there's always this, like, you know, some people prefer the simplicity and ease of the saliva test, but people were also concerned about the accuracy of the oral swab test and wanted to use a blood test. And when technical experts suggested inclusion of provider-assisted testing, so they agreed with the initial test types, but said it makes sense if there's somebody available. So for example, a 32-year-old clinical research assistant said, "I think if it is going to be possible to have this trained person within the pharmacy who will also have the knowledge or have training in HIV testing, then I'll not mind also having the rapid diagnostic test." So this is the provider-assisted one within the pharmacies, so that if someone purchases the HIV self-test kit, they can decide to test within the pharmacy. Okay. And then another change we made as far as the HIV prevention attributes is that we collapsed the PrEP initiation and refills to one 2-level attribute. So PrEP availability with the levels yes and no. And so while we had initially considered a 3-level attribute with an option for refills only, it largely wasn't supported by technical experts. And the reason we initially considered the refill option was that in the early days of implementing PrEP in pharmacies, there were regulatory concerns about what could be done in the setting. And it seemed that allowing PrEP refills only would fit under the realm of what pharmacy providers were allowed to do. But then technical experts felt this should not be an option because of the logistical barriers it might impose upon clients. And so one person, for example, said, "I would go for starting and getting a refill at the same point, because starting and getting a refill in another location may come at a cost to the client in a way and causing confusion, because PrEP delivery comes with documentation and everything else." So additionally, we also felt really because of the growing evidence that PrEP initiation in pharmacies is feasible, there should be a 2-level attribute. And just bear in mind, this has been going on for the past couple of years, so a lot of the landscape is changing. So yeah. And then on the service side, we refined and reduced the service attributes to 3 attributes. So focusing on the location, the service fee, and how one gets the services. So over and over again, what we kept hearing was how important having a health provider was to the women. And when we asked them to rank the attributes, so you'll see the ranking on the left side there, health provider was more than often came out on top as the most important attribute. And so what we did realize that if we were to, this was likely to have a really significant impact on the service a woman would choose. So if that was one of the service options, like health provider present in one service and health provider not present in another, they would definitely pick the one or the health provider present all the time. So, and not trade on the other attributes. So we decided to eliminate health provider. And then the assumption would be in either service, be it a pharmacy-based or like antenatal care service, a health provider would be available to the women. And then we also found that women ranked the wait time, how long it takes to get the services, and follow-up attributes really low, because they felt that pharmacy wait times were usually short and unlikely to affect their decision to use the service. And then they also expressed privacy concerns around follow-up, or felt that this really should be treated on a case-by-case basis. So we went ahead and eliminated those attributes as well. just to call out privacy here, because we had an option for private room available if that was a concern to the women. Privacy was obviously very important, and we ended up including this as a level versus like a separate attribute under location. And the idea here would be to see if there's any utility gain by having care available at a pharmacy without a private room versus an antenatal care clinic. The typical setup for pharmacies is that there's a mix. So maybe in urban areas, maybe you tend to have pharmacies that would have a private room versus in rural areas, for instance. It's kind of like your standalone, you go to a counter and request services. So we wanted to see if there was any chance like people would be interested in the services in that context. But at the same time, from a design standpoint, we wanted to reduce the number of attributes. We didn't want to have too many because that would result in so many, I guess it would kind of burden participants in making the decision. So we decided to collapse that. And so we'd have location, and the levels would be antenatal care clinic, pharmacy with a private room, and then pharmacy without a private room. And then finally, based on initial participant feedback in terms of what they were willing to pay, we included 3 levels. So for the service fee, so that would be free, 300 Kenya shillings, so about the equivalent of $3 or so, and then 500 Kenya shillings, so about $5. And this one was an interesting attribute. I'll walk you through some of our initial thoughts here. We had this attribute called operation hours, and we initially refined operation hours to include women's preferences for the timing of services. So you can see there, so we're allowing for options of Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., just your usual working day, or extended hours in the evening during the month from Monday to Friday, so through 10 p.m., or pretty much open Monday through Friday and weekends, early and late at night, early through late in the evening. So, but when we took this attribute to technical experts, they suggested that really opening hours might vary across the facilities, and the more flexible hours were unrealistic in the antenatal care clinic setting. And also workflow adjustments in pharmacies might require scheduling options. So we ended up refining this attribute to how one gets services with the level. So appointment only, do they have to make an appointment, or do they have to walk in on specific days and times of the week, or can they walk in anytime? So that was a key change we made based on that feedback there. And overall, we identified 4 3-level attributes and 3 2-level attributes. So 3-level being the location, you can see there, and then the type of HIV test you use, and then how you get the services and how much you pay for the services. And then the STI testing and partner testing and PrEP availability were 2-level attributes. So it's either available or it's not available. What I don't have on the slides today, which I'll just kind of talk you through, I don't think I have all the material there. We're actually wrapping up our cognitive interviews to assess whether the survey questions are clearly and accurately understood. I have some initial, but not all, so I'll just walk you through these slides. So in terms of the changes we've made so far, so far we've made changes to the types of words and phrases used in the attributes and levels, so to ensure that participants actually understand what we're talking about. One change that was interesting, I think we came in using the term antenatal care clinic, and women said that they use the term clinic or clinic for pregnant women, not antenatal care clinic. So we've changed that phrasing. And then additionally, women, like community pharmacy was not something that was typically used, which we were kind of aware of that, but we just wanted to test it. And they said that women use the term pharmacy or chemist. So we've changed that as well. And I think we changed, so we initially made the change to nearby pharmacy and versus just community pharmacy, really to get the concept that this would be a pharmacy within their locale where there's like where they live. I will point out that we kind of got, in as much as we made those changes, we did get feedback from other experts in this regard that maybe we won't be able to tease out the reason that women are making the choice, as far as, are they picking a pharmacy because it's near or close to them, and what does it mean for a clinic? Are there an clinic for pregnant women or antenatal care clinic? Does it mean that that clinic is further from them? So what we've actually done, which is not shown here, is that we've taken this apart, and the levels are now clinic for pregnant women, pharmacy with a private room, and pharmacy without a private room. And we have a new attribute, which is distance or travel time, which gives a sense of how far women are willing to travel for the services. And we ultimately ended up dropping the how you get the services attribute. So this one back here, the second to last one, because when we did the cognitive interviews, we found that women were actually interpreting, like making an appointment differently. Some people didn't get it, or they didn't, they don't usually make appointments, so contextually it was out of place. And then in some cases, women were actually not using it to inform their decision making. So we dropped that, and we ended up adding travel time there. And then for the type of HIV test, we found that oral swab was too like maybe more of a clinical term, and we changed that to a saliva test. Yeah, and I think those were the key changes so far. Yeah, but essentially what we're doing is we're really wrapping up with those cognitive interviews. We wrapped up last week, sorry, and so making updates to the survey based on those findings. And the next step is really to include 8 sections in the overall survey, including the DCE choice questions. So we'll, obviously screening, informed consent sections, then asking women about their historical experiences, whether they've had any experiences with HIV prevention services, pharmacies, antenatal care. And then we'll introduce the discrete choice experiment. We plan to have 12 choice questions described by the final set of attributes and levels. We'll also look at attitudes, the attitudes to pharmacies, maybe their reasons for preferring pharmacies over antenatal care clinics and vice versa, and the perception of privacy in pharmacy and antenatal care clinics. The focus on attitudes came up because during the focus group discussions, we got a lot of, there were concerns about issues like, oh, are these quacks, or, are they professional? So we really want to tease this out in a subsection of the survey. And then also looking at the HIV risk perception, how participants perceive the HIV risk and that of their friends. And then just general social demographics and the costs associated with care seeking. And then a sense of whether they understood or found the survey difficult or not. So that's kind of like the next steps. I think it's about like 35 minutes and I went through that pretty fast, but I just want to acknowledge the bigger team behind this, the folks who've been doing a lot of work collecting the data, and the women that we're working with as well, who've been kind enough to share their views as we move forward. But happy to kind of take any questions or go back if anything wasn't clear. Yeah.
Melissa, are you taking questions?
Yes, I can take any questions or clarify stuff. I don't know whether I went through it really fast, but anyway,
Yeah, so just
it
to
took
make
me
sure.
long the last time.
Yeah, sure. Just to make sure I'm following. So when you say conduct 12 DCE choice questions,
Yeah.
does that mean that you present 12 scenarios that represent different combinations of these attributes and levels? And
Yes, that is
so
correct. Let me just show kind of just for clarity. If I have this is you might see do you see a Word document or no?
Here we go.
Yeah, so this is kind of the design we're working on. This is like a work in progress. So essentially what it won't look like this because it'll be more of a tablet, but they'll be asked to pick one of two services. So you go to a pharmacy without a private room, it takes you 15 minutes to get there. You test yourself with a blood-based test. STI testing is available. You can take an HIV test to your partner. PrEP is available, and this is how much you pay. Oh, that's another note. So we actually ended up increasing this. It was initially 500 was the high amount, but we increased it to 750 just because in the cognitive interviews, people were picking the 500 shilling option anyway. So we felt we weren't pushing there. We weren't really getting a sense of their maximum willingness to pay. So.
That's amazing that you can, with 12 scenarios or 12 of these choice sets, that you can tease out all those different attributes and levels.
So just to make sure I'm getting you.
Yeah,
so
is
what
this
we
a
actually
fully
do,
factorial kind of design or partial? Or are there certain attributes that you're not testing, you're just keeping constant?
all the attributes would be tested because it's like each person would see. So for each question, each person gets a version of a survey. So when you run the model, we actually asked for 72 possible choice questions or scenarios. And so we kind of divide that by 6. So each person gets like one of 12 versions of the survey.
Okay, gotcha.
So that way you're kind of able to, the goal is to, the different designs or ways of designing the survey, I won't get into like all the specifics, but we're looking at an efficient design. So we're looking at a design, the way you programmed it, we want to minimize the errors. And we want to focus on those questions that make sense, at least in this context. Like, so we don't have any, like we wouldn't have something where like maybe it costs 750 shillings and it's 60 minutes away. It's like everything is really, really bad. It's a dominant alternative. We want to make sure that's not what women are seeing because we won't get any information in them. The type of questions we want to show them is where we know that they'll make a trade-off. We know that, they'll use all the different attributes in making their decision. Anyway, so to your point, we won't cover like the entire universe of choice questions, but we'll try to get enough variability in the data, of variability in the attributes and levels, so at least we get a sense of which attributes are most important to the women. But if we had if we just showed like maybe 5 choice questions out of all the possible combinations, then we wouldn't get enough information.
This is Yang Fang.
Hi, Yang Fang. Nice to see you, hear you.
Yes, I'm running outdoor. So regarding the trade-off, actually, we made an assumption that for all of the attributes, it's the situation women would prefer A over B, but I want to have your thinking regarding the situation of indifferent choices. For instance, if I'm not very sensitive to price or the fees, and in that case, actually the attribute regarding the price or the fee won't be the factor that I will take into account in my decision making. So actually, like for my student, she's also designing her discrete choice experiment, and that is one thing actually really bothered me regarding the assumption about trade-off. So in any case, if there is any of the situation that like for 2 choices, actually the women would be in the situation, they think, oh, actually, like for one attribute, it's indifferent from choice A and B.
So say that again. I think I missed it. Like,
okay, so maybe let me take a step back. In economics, we will consider a situation in which it's indifferent of the choices. Say, if you want me to make a decision, choice A and B, I would say that, oh, actually, it's indifferent to me in the sense that those 2 are quite equivalent to each other. So in the case of paying fees to receive the PrEP service, and then if it's $1 or $2, And then I might say that, oh, actually, I'm not very sensitive to the fee. And then to that extent, it's indifferent to me. So that might violate the trade-off assumption in the experimental design.
So you're saying if somebody is indifferent to a particular attributes and they're not using it to inform their decision making, is that what you're getting at?
Yes, yes. In that sense, actually, like we will we will reduce the degree of the attributes by one if like for that attribute actually is indifferent for the woman.
Okay, I have not entirely got your question.
No
but
worries.
I'm going to
uh-huh.
go, Angeli, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder, and please correct me if I'm mishearing you,
Mhm.
Yanfeng, about what your question is, and please correct me, Melissa, if I've misinterpreted your presentation. Yanfeng, what I'm hearing from you is about like, you know, if there's no concrete choice or preference between A versus B on a particular attribute, then what do you do about that? And my sense from hearing Melissa's presentation is that individuals are not ranking specific attributes, A versus B, they're looking at a whole scenario. And there are several attributes of that scenario. And it seems highly unlikely to me that someone would be indifferent to all of the attributes that create scenario A versus scenario B. And so it seems very unlikely that they would have indifference on all of them. And if they're indifferent on price, that's fine. They can be indifferent on that, but there are other attributes that define the two scenarios. Did I understand your question, Yanfeng, or is
yes,
it?
Yeah, I think like if we make a very simple scenario, say there are two attributes, one is distance and another is the gender of the provider. And then if the pregnant woman in the hypothetical scenario said that, oh, actually, I have no preference regarding gender. Like I can either go to the male provider or female. And actually for the choice set we created, there was only one attribute that really like in the sense of trade-off. Like for the other, since it's indifferent, and then for the choice set itself, actually we're not testing, or say it's a little bit difficult to test like whether there will be a kind of the situation in which gender would be indifferent for the participant, or maybe like empirically, Melissa, is that possible in the result that like for the choices, the woman would say that, oh, I would say choice A and B is indifferent for me. Is that a situation, or do they need to rate like A over B?
Oh, got it. Yeah, so we actually do provide, it wasn't shown in the Word document, we do provide an opt-out option. So we say, when we introduce it, we say, so imagine you're pregnant seeking HIV prevention services, you can get them. We're going to show you a set of services where you can, I guess, options, scenarios where you can get the HIV prevention services from. But if you choose to select none, that means you don't get any HIV prevention services in pregnancy. So essentially we're saying if they opt out, then those services won't be available to them. And it is possible, like from the cognitive interviews, for the most part, everyone was selecting some sort of service. It was only in some cases where, like maybe there was one case where some woman was like completely adamant. She was like, no, I don't want any pharmacy service. And anytime pharmacies appeared, she'd just select none. So I guess for that, we'd need to tease out whether there are two reasons, maybe two at least reasons someone would select none. It's either they're just not interested in the survey and it's like, it's just too much work. I'm not interested, none. Or maybe they're just genuinely not interested in that particular service option. And they just will not, whatever you do, they'd rather just not get any HIV prevention services from a pharmacy than get then basically they'd rather like not go to a pharmacy and get HIV prevention services. So it is possible that some people can select none. I hope that answers your question. And maybe.
Yeah, thank you for your clarification. It's good to know that some of the women, they still have the choice to select none while they responding to the survey. And can they choose, say, they in the trade-off, they was offered either like choose A or B. Can they say that like A and B are equivalent to me or say indifferent to me? Is that the third option in their response?
if they're indifferent to A or B, so they
Mhm.
not want A or B, so then they would select the none option, correct? that-
It's not necessary. Like, maybe they will say it's not in my choices. It's not in my consideration, and that's why it's none. But in another situation, say after considering all of the trade-offs of A and B, actually, I would say that it's almost the same, or say it's equivalent. Is that like one of the possible options for their choice?
No, what we'll get at is like, so they'll just get the service A, the service B, and then if they don't want that, they'd select,
see.
like if none, they just basically have 3 options to
Three,
select
uh-huh.
from. Yeah.
Right, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. So if they find them equally, if they have no preference over of A or B, not because they don't want either one, but because they like both of them, there's no response option to indicate I like both. It's either you choose I prefer A, or I prefer B, or I prefer none. Those are the 3 response options when presented
Yeah,
with
those are the 3 options. I mean, they're forced to choose. I think I'm just trying to reflect on some of, when for the cognitive interviews, in some cases, a woman says like, oh, service A has STI testing, but oh, service B has PrEP. And then she'd be forced to make a decision based on like what is more important to her. That's kind of what we want to happen, so that at least we can actually quantify which attribute is more important overall. Yeah.
Melissa, this is really great to hear. And I had a question that was related to the strength of preference. And, with a binary, do you prefer this or that? That's, very helpful in teasing out like the relative weight of these various attributes in their binary form, but against one another. But I wonder if there's any like valence on, if you've seen, the concept of like, I strongly prefer, like the example that you gave earlier about, provider A versus B, and you really in every scenario would pick having a female provider. Like, I wonder if there's some strength shown in here, which is like, well, I could go for either of these. I slightly prefer this over that. So that was my first question, is around valence. And then the second question that I had is around how this, if you've seen any comparisons of DCE preference elicitation against people's like empirical behavior of what they end up doing in the end, and how those compare to one another. Just curious about that.
Okay, I'll take, so the last question about what people do as part of the DC and what they do in practice, it's kind of like a key struggle. At this point, I haven't seen, I guess, a study that has looked at that. In fact, Arnav and Basu at Women in Choice was really pushing for like, adding a second piece to this where we actually test and maybe just roll out just a very mini version of this program and find out if these women actually take up the services, which would be interesting. Yeah, so I haven't seen that, but at least for the purpose of this discrete choice experiment, what we're trying to do is to the extent possible, minimize hypothetical bias, so that, by making sure, taking participants, like pre-testing the survey, do these services make sense? Is it something that you, just really make sure they know if you say stupid questions, I guess is, yeah, so it makes sense to participants. And then also making sure that we're asking a large enough sample. So we're kind of accounting for that error that might come from hypothetical bias. But I guess a clean approach would be to do the DCE and then roll out a service and see what confirm that people actually doing what they said they would do as part of this. But we realize that there's so many things that influence decisions, and we can't really capture that. We only capture that as part of an error term when we're actually doing the analysis. So, but this is at least it's the most one of the more systematic approaches to actually quantifying preferences versus just asking, hey, what do you want? To your first point, are there any other attributes? So I guess similar, like that are really driving the decisions. Is that what you were getting at?
I was more getting
Yeah.
at like if there's any amount of like magnitude of preference. There's a preference of like A or B, but I'm curious about whether, you know, whether there's ever been incorporated a range of responses that say everything from what Yanfeng was saying before of like, I find these two generally equivalent. I could go for either, all the way to I really strongly prefer A over B, and whether that has ever been incorporated.
I guess the closest, like what I'm hearing is more of heterogeneity in like in preferences. And there are methods to kind of capture that. I guess what we will do is like the latent class analysis. So essentially we'll kind of tease out the different groups and how preferences differ among those groups and what those groups are characterized by. I think that's kind of like where we'll see like where maybe a particular group is really crazy about like, yeah, I want my pharmacy close to me and I want to get my services nearby in a private, you know, pharmacy with a private room. And then there might be a particular set of people who's like, no, I actually don't want to access services in the community because people are going to see me. I'd rather travel 60 minutes and get, you know, so maybe in that case, we would see like that kind of heterogeneity in preferences.
So Melissa, that's really interesting. I was wondering the same thing. It's like if I'm following correctly, you'll get out of this more than just a main effects analysis for the attributes to figure out on average across the sample which of these attributes are more preferred than others. But what I heard you say, which was where my question is that you're using latent class analysis, you'll also be able to explore heterogeneity in preferences, meaning there may be different subgroups of women who participate in your study who have different preferences, and you'll be able to identify those groups to, you know, maybe the younger women and the older women, or those that have had a baby previously been pregnant versus those who have not. They may have different preferences based on the choice sets, and you'll be able to tease out whether there are different groups using latent class analysis.
Right.
Cool.
That is correct.
Just another technical question. Do you have to do you randomly order the choice sets so that there isn't an ordering effect? Or is that something that people don't worry about? Because when I do surveys, you know, I try to randomly order the items, or at least the vignettes, so that we deal with potential ordering effects. I'm just curious if that's an issue that it comes up in DCEs as well.
Yes, it is an issue. So I think for this one, we're looking at, there's 6 versions of the survey, so 12 questions per survey. So what we're trying to do for each version, we're going to randomize that like several times, 50 times. So each person will see a different like order, like within a version, there'll be a different ordering of the questions, and largely because of that issue of the learning effect. So it takes some time for people to learn or get, you know, accustomed to the questions in the beginning. So there might be error there. And then the fatigue effect at the end, people get tired. So we want to just kind of balance that out, so they're not seeing the same question first all the time. Yeah.
And Anjali, I just have to say I resonate with your question, because every time I go to the optometrist and they do that thing with the things and like, which one do you prefer, A or B? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, they're so close. I can't, you know, A.
That's
So,
true.
but it's, you know, it's really, there are times when it's like, I don't really know. And other times like, oh yeah, definitely one or the other. So I can see how the strength of one's preferences could really vary. And it sounds like, Melissa, it's the task is complicated enough, but as it is with different sets, so you really just kind of keep people choosing A versus B or none, rather than how much of A versus B or how much of B versus A, which would probably introduce a lot more complexity cognitively for the person, and then maybe analytically too.
Yeah, and I hear you, and I think maybe that's something I struggled with initially as well. I was like, but what if people are not, you know, we're making mistakes along the way and we're giving them these questions, like how accurate is the data? But the point is, we're giving them multiple questions to choose from, and we're asking, like, it's not just 1 or 2 people. Hopefully we'll ask like 600 people, and that kind of helps, you know, spread, you know, address those issues. Yeah,
and all that gets into the error term. But if you give them multiple choices, you can kind of correct for errors or learning effects or other sorts of things that go on. So Cool. And
I
we
feel
just,
like that's where like trusting your experimental design comes into. Like, sorry, I'm in a noisy place, but you sort of believe that you have an efficient design and you're going to be able to get at all of those combinations. Here, I'll mute now.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, in terms of that's the goal with the efficient design, just pointing that what Liz pointed out there. So essentially we're exposing participants to all the like relevant combinations and permutations of the attributes and levels, versus I think I don't think I can speak to this quite like eloquently as yet, but there are like different types of approaches to designing the survey. You could, because essentially you're taking your attributes and levels and just like coming up with all these different combinations, right? And what you could do is you could have the whole universe of combinations and just randomly select those combinations and say, here is a random subset of like 10 questions, answer them. Or you could take a more efficient approach and just focus on the ones that really matter and then give that to participants, which is like what we're trying to do. And I think there's another approach where it's orthogonal and whatnot. So you're really trying, I'm not going to speak about this now because I think I'm not going to talk about it well, but I can follow up. But basically there's the randomized design, orthogonal and efficient one, and which one, the one we're aiming for is the efficient one. Yeah.
Melissa,
cool.
see
I
one-
can see lots
go
of
ahead.
uses for DCEs in implementation science. And I was going to say, I was going to start saying, it looks like yours is mostly focused on the what sort of things that we want to have implemented, but actually that's not true. Several of these attributes also have to do with the how, rather than the what. And so there are sort of implementation strategies embedded in your DCE. So it's really neat to see how you can also look to see, how you could apply this to implementation strategies like clinic hours and the who and the when and the where, and with a private room and not a private room and all that kind of stuff. So really cool.
That's true. Yeah. And if any one of you just want to work on DCs in general, Liz is also working on DC, and yeah, happy to work with you as well. Yeah.
Cool beans.
Melissa, there's a comment from Dorothy in the chat box from a little bit earlier. And she
Oh,
said, I
sorry,
imagine
let me go.
stigma plays a role in some women's choices. Will there be any baseline measure of experienced or anticipated stigma or a follow-up interview to examine respondents' reasons for picking different options? And I wonder how you might think about that, like reasons why people have preferences and how that might relate to the latent class analysis of identifying user profiles.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So we don't, let me see. We don't tease out stigma per se, like have a set of questions on that. We had to prioritize and pick and choose which follow-up questions to ask after people complete the choice questions. And we focused more on attitudes to pharmacies, just because it was a really big theme that came up. Stigma came up, but not as much as this idea of like people's perception of pharmacies and perceptions as far as, are they quality like trained personnel? Can I trust them? I think trust in pharmacies was a huge thing. So we decided to have follow-up questions on that. I guess maybe we might get a sense of, stigma in terms of, we ask a follow-up question in terms of what are the top 3 reasons you would choose a pharmacy over a clinic, and maybe provide that option, or it's, is basically you're scared that somebody will see you. There's one like choice option there in terms of people can select that as one of the top 3 reasons. So I guess that's the extent to which we touch on stigma. And I think maybe in one interview, cognitive interview, just came up in terms of one woman was saying, yeah, for me, it's not an issue. I can just go to, get my services close by. But there are some women who have issues and they have to go far away. So maybe for those women who are selecting services farther away, it could be something where stigma is influencing that decision making. But I think in order to do a thorough analysis of that, I guess we need to follow up with another study. Yeah.
Melissa, thank you so much. This was, as you can tell, like stimulated a ton of discussion. It was an excellent presentation, and I really appreciated people's engagement on this. We're just past on the time right now, but thank you for sharing this with the group. I also want to plant an idea that as you were talking about survey biases, it would be really cool to have a primer from you at any point, if you're up for it, about the different types of biases that can be present in surveys and how to overcome those, because that's stuff that many of us, I agree, Brian, the slides were really lovely and super informative. It would be really cool to hear, so that we're not learning by making the mistakes like I've done this year. And it would be fabulous because it sounds like you've learned not only this particular method, but also a lot around like minimizing bias in survey design. So Brian, Melissa, if you think of ways in which you can bring that to WISE, we'd really encourage it.
I've made plenty of mistakes myself, so. See how.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks everyone for
Melissa.
listening. Feel free to reach out with questions. All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.